All right, thank you so much everybody for joining our 13th SPL meeting. It is a pleasure to have you with us. Today we'll be talking about the effects of adoption of advanced technologies. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers. My name is ALEXANDRA TSVETKOVA. I lead the Spatial Productivity Lab at the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development. So today, as I said, we'll be talking about adoption of advanced technologies, and it is one of the topics that is addressed by quite a bit of OECD work. For those of you who do not know us, the Spatial Productivity Lab is a more research-oriented unit that tries to look at the subnational drivers of growth. And more specifically, we try to generate knowledge that helps policymakers to design policies which help increase growth, but also to decrease inter-regional inequalities. In more general terms, we produce knowledge, we stimulate debate about the topic of regional growth. And probably the best part is that we do not do it alone. We have an excellent and growing network of partners who participate with us in research projects, but also organize meetings like the meeting we have today. So today's meeting is co-organized with Productivity Partnership, which is based in Canada. And I would like to invite Director of the Partnership and Professor of Economics at McMaster University in Canada, Michael Veal, to offer his welcome remarks.
So I would just like to welcome everyone to this event. This is the first event in our partnership between the Productivity Partnership, which is in Canada, as ALEXANDRA said, and is sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And this is the first event in our partnership with the Center for Spatial Analysis at the OECD Trento as part of the Center for Local Development. And we are so pleased that everyone has come, and so effective a group of speakers that I am anxious to hear. And so I will say no more and just say, I will say a little bit more later towards the end, but right now I'm anxious to hear our speakers.
Thank you, Mike. It's quite early in Canada, and I'm very happy to have quite a bit of speakers from the other side of the Atlantic. So I will be chairing today's session. My name is ALEXANDRA TSVETKOVA, as I said. I lead Spatial Productivity Lab at the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development. The structure for today's meeting is, first, we will start with 4 presentations, which are looking at different dimensions of adoption of advanced technologies. After the presentations, we will have time, hopefully, if we stay on time, to ask questions to our experts. So we'll have a roundtable discussion and a Q&A. It will be mixed together depending on how much time we have and how many questions we receive from the audience. As I said before, for those of you who joined later, please use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to pose your questions, either the general ones or specific ones to specific speakers on our panel today. So after the presentation, the discussion, the meeting will conclude with remarks from Mike Veal, who just offered his welcome from the Productivity Partnership. All right, without further ado, I would like to move to the first presentation. It will be presented by BENOIT DOSTIE, who is professor at the Department of Applied Economics at HEC Montreal in Canada. So we're starting with a mix of firm level data and regional insights from this data. His presentation will offer pretty much background for the adoption of advanced technologies in Quebec firms, but also in few other Canadian regions. Benoit, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, ALEXANDRA. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk about the adoption of advanced technologies by Quebec firms. This is, as written here, joint work with Geneviève Dufour, who's at Cyrano, which is a research organization in Montreal. And this is, should also mention that this is jointly funded by both the Productivity Partnership and the Quebec government. So it's a nice example of collaboration between governmental authorities and academia, as you could see. My first slide, please. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're looking at regional variation and the rate of adoption of advanced technologies. And in particular, well, my interest is how does Quebec compare to the rest of Canada? And we're going to identify later in the presentation, hopefully, some drivers of adoption. What makes some firm adopt new technologies, and why do some firms don't adopt new technologies? Next slide, please. So the survey we're using, maybe you've heard about it. It's called the Survey of Innovation and Business Strategy. It's a cross-economy survey of business enterprises and industrial nonprofit organizations in Canada. It has information on what technologies firms are using, but it also has a ton of other information you might be interested in, like market characteristics of the firm, business strategy. I know some other speaker here have used this survey. Business practices, participation in global value chains. For this report, I have data from 2009, 2012, 2017. And if you follow Statistics Canada website, you see that there was a new survey in 2020, and the results are slowly trickling down from the StatCan website. Two other things to mention are that some of the firms are followed across surveys. So if you take the 2009 and 2012 waves, there's a panel dimension from a subset of the firms. And I think it's the same for 2017 and 2020. And for every survey, they ask firms, did you adopt such technology in the last 3 years? So it's retrospective in that respect. So next slide, please. So in terms of target population, of course, the survey is targeting bigger firms who have at least 250,000 in revenues. And if you want to look at the regional variations in how business operates, well, it's hard to get high enough sample size. So the stratification we can use is we can have representative results for Quebec and Ontario, which are the two biggest provinces in Canada. It's something that it's nice to learn some geography in the same time. You can have results for the Atlantic region, so the eastern part of Canada. And the rest of Canada is basically everything else, mostly BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, just the western part. So the next slide is showing some of the advanced technologies. I wanted to stick under 10 minutes, so I didn't give you the complete list. So if you want the complete list of what firms are surveyed about, send me an email or ask in the chat. But for 2009 and 2012, they asked firms about 10 different types of technologies. You have a flavor of the questions here: advanced computerized design and engineering, advanced computerized processing, fabrication and assembly, etc., etc., advanced green technologies. Unfortunately, in the next slide, you will see that in 2017, they kind of modified their technology question. So you cannot link all the way from 2017 to 2009 to see how the technology process evolved in Canada. So in 2017, they differentiated between advanced technologies and emerging technologies. So you see that some advanced technologies here, it's material handling, supply chains or logistics, clean technologies. Emerging technologies are, I guess, less used or are just emerging, as they say. So that's the case for artificial intelligence, or you might have heard the Internet of Things system, integrated Internet of Things system. So if you want to have an idea of how much regional variation there is in those technologies, the two next slides are showing you rate of adoptions for for the different region I outlined before. This is a little bit small, apparently. The two blue bars on the left are for the two biggest provinces, Quebec and Ontario. So the rate of adoption of any of the advanced technologies is around 42%. Was kind of surprised that the two provinces would be so close. The lower bar in the middle is for the Atlantic. Here it's much lower, it's 35.3%. The average for the rest of Canada, that's the western part, is a little bit higher than the middle part, 46.4, and the red bar is the average for Canada. So basically, the average for Canada is mostly in line with the average for the two biggest provinces. For emerging technologies on the next slide, since the technologies are emerging, rates of adoption are lower. I was surprised again to see that Canada and Ontario Quebec and Ontario were so close. This time, Quebec is a little bit ahead in terms of its rate of adoption, and again, Atlantic in the middle is lower. And this time, the rest of Canada is also much lower. So there is a big lead in the adoption of emerging technologies for the two biggest provinces, whereas for advanced technologies, it's more evenly spread out regionally than for emerging technologies. So in the complete report, as you can see on the next slide, we looked at those regional variations, and we try to explain why some firms do adopt new technologies and some other firms don't. And from the survey, we can build a very exhaustive set of explanatory variables. We have the subsidiary status of the firm, the location of the head office, could be in Canada and some other provinces, could be outside Canada. Exporting activities, whether it's manufacturing or services, percentage of employees with a university degree. In many of those firm surveys, we don't have much information on the workforce, but we have at least this variable in that survey. We even know if the firm use some government programs to get subsidies or help in buying new technologies. We have firm size and number of employees and industry. The results from those regressions are in the report that is coming soon, but what I want to mention here is that even taking into account all those characteristics, we do see some leftover regional variation that is left unexplained. So that's something that we'd like to dwell a little bit later, but it's still a mystery why some firms do adopt new technologies, even taking into account those characteristics. Some of those characteristics, of course, are more important than others in terms of explaining the decision to adopt new technologies. And in the next slide, I outlined the four most important, or the four that come up as more statistically significant for more new technologies, for more regions. The first one is not surprising. Larger firms are more likely to adopt advanced or emerging technologies. So that's, you see that for all types of technologies, whether they're advanced or emerging or anywhere. So the other factor that seems to be very important is whether the firm is an exporter. There's a large literature showing that exporting firms are more productive. This could be a channel that makes firms more productive, because we also see that firms with business activities outside Canada, exports, are also much more likely to adopt new technologies than others. A third factor that comes out pretty often, but less, but you see the number of pluses diminishes. Firms with more competitors, they are also more likely to adopt new technologies. This might not surprise you. You might be aware of the literature on the link between competition and innovation. And we get the same type of relationship here. If you have a very low number of competitors, it has no impact. If you have a medium level of competitors, it has an impact. And as your number of competitors increases even more, the impact diminishes. So it's kind of inverse U-shaped relationship for some technologies and competition. And finally, you hear that education is important. I was expecting this to show up more strongly, but it doesn't. But for some technologies, maybe there's a link between the type of technologies. We haven't looked at this yet, but the percentage of employees with a university degree also has an impact on whether the firm adopt the new technology or not. These are the 4 factors that that come out more strongly in the regression analysis. So to conclude briefly, on the next slide, so what's coming next here is that there's a report if you want to see the regression results and in all their glory. Should be coming soon. It will be posted on both the Cyrano website and the Productivity Partnership website. So what's exciting is that CIBS 2020 is coming. So right now we have aggregate results coming from the StatCan website, but we'd like to get a hold of the micro data to see what we can do with it. And it should be, if there's anyone from StatCan on this conference, it would be nice to have the CIBS, the survey linked to other surveys, so we can have, there is some measure of performance of the firm in the survey, but we'd like some objective measure, so maybe by using text data linked to CIBS. So this is a wish for people who are listening, and we can do something about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Benoit. I think it was a great scene setting, in a sense, presentation, which showed that regional dimension still matters for the adoption of advanced technologies. It was also toward the force of what advanced technologies mean. So I think it's very useful to position our discussion going forward. My takeaway from your presentation, I think what struck me most is that the advanced technologies, and I think it's something that shouldn't surprise anyone, is that larger and more expert-oriented firms are more likely to use them. So this has the potential to increase inequalities across firms. And this links back to quite a bit of work on the productivity discrepancies or divergence that is happening now. So I would like to actually come back to it in the discussion afterwards. And now let me move to the next presentation, which will look again at Canada, but we'll look at the firm level evidence and how the adoption of robots, what are the effects of adoption of robots on managerial decisions, but also on the employment. The presentation will be done by Bryan Hong, who is assistant professor at the Henry Block School of Management at University of Missouri, Kansas City in the United States. Bryan, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Can we just go to the next slide, which I think is the opening slide for my, oh, okay. So that's actually been edited out. So I will just say what I meant to say on the opening slide. So this is joint work with Jay Dixon at Statistics Canada and also Lin Wu at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And we, as Alexandra was saying, wanted to investigate the effect of robots on how it was changing, what was happening inside firms. So this is, you know, for you guys as an audience in particular, I don't think I need to sell very hard why we should care. But if you do look out at the popular business press, you do see a lot of articles written about automation more broadly, but also robots as well. I've just got a couple of these headlines here. So if you look at the one here at the top right, robots will destroy our jobs and we're not ready for it. And there's already numbers being thrown around. So here at the top left, robot automation will take away 800 million jobs by 2030. And if you consider that in the context of broader global employment, these are very large numbers that we should be thinking about if you believe them, if you think that this is actually true. And we've already gotten to the point now where politicians are already starting to propose policy prescriptions. So the bottom right-hand corner is just one example. This is an article about New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio when he was running for president of the United States. One of the things that he had proposed was a robot tax, right, to directly address some of the perceived issues that he saw arising from this increase in automation and robots in particular. So we've already gotten to that point. And what's interesting is that on the academic side, we really are still in the nascent stages of the literature. This is far from concluded. But out there in the business world, shall we say, or among policy circles, there are people who are already talking about answers to problems that we are still trying to establish. And so if we could just go to the next slide. So the purpose of this study and the motivation for us was to really try to investigate how robots are changing the way that firms are organized, broadly speaking. But number one is the employment question. So are robots really negative or positive for employment? We're talking about kind of the total number of people that would be working in a firm. But above and beyond that, of course, there's the question of, well, beyond that, how might they affect workforce composition? Because in previous waves of technology adoption that we've seen in the world, we have seen evidence of skill-biased technical change. It is not true that everybody equally benefits in terms of their employment demand when these new technologies are adopted. And so with robots, do we see something very similar to what we might have seen in the past with IT, or do we see something different? And that remains an open question that we wanted to go after. And then thirdly, do we see any types of systematic organizational change? Because one of the things that we also know from prior literature and ways of technology adoption is it's not as simple in the productivity story of just that the computers arrive and productivity just happens. One thing that we certainly know is that in order to get those productivity gains, firms have to reconfigure the way that they are designed. And so we're going to look at one aspect of that, which is the allocation of decision authority, to see whether that has changed in response to robot adoption. So next slide, please. So let's start with the employment question. What's the effect of robots on employment? That's certainly where a lot of the press is focused on. And of course, there's, well, the good and the bad answer, right? Answer number one, robots are negative for employment. And this is not a very difficult thing to argue theoretically about what's happening there. It's just that robots would, substitute for labor. And the very early studies in this literature tended to support this view, that we would tend to see very negative effects. But in theory, right, and if I just sort of put aside those studies, we don't necessarily think, or we shouldn't necessarily think, that that would be the be-all end-all answer. Another reason why we might think that it might be the opposite, they might be positive for employment, is because of the idea of complementarity. That there might be things that humans can do that are complementary skills or tasks to robots. And there's a number of different ways in which this could occur. But it doesn't have to be the case, even in theory, that robots are bad for employment. So next slide, please. So it's worth mentioning a couple things about these early studies and about why we shouldn't necessarily think that they reach the final and necessarily even correct answers. And it's because of the level of analysis that these studies had been conducted at. So they obviously had done the best that they could with the data that they had, but most of the studies so far have been at the country or the industry level. And there's several issues with this. One is that it's really difficult to observe mechanisms when you're running regressions at that level. It's also true that it's not really countries and industries that adopt robots, it's firms that make that endogenous choice. And one thing that we know about firms is that there's tremendous heterogeneity across firms. And this is something that's well documented in the economics literature. And so in the past, also, we've seen that running this type of analysis at the firm level is actually quite important to uncover what the true effects might actually be. And again, one clear example of this in the past is the IT productivity paradox. It was very difficult to understand what was going on with that until people got firm level data and were able to analyze firm level data to figure that out. And that's one of the insights that came out of that, of course, was that organizational change was absolutely critical as a way to extract a lot of the benefits of new technology adoption. And we couldn't really get there without running analysis at the firm level. So all this to motivate, of course, a firm level analysis. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show a couple of just graphs showing the proliferation of robot adoption. This is across several major industries in Canada. So this is national robot stock, if you will. And the blue bar is the one that's the most recent in our data, so 2017. And what I just want to draw your attention to just the overall trend, right? We are seeing that there is an increase in robot adoption across a variety of different industries and also geographies as well. So on the next slide, what we've got here, what I want you to notice is that as the years progress, the map is becoming more purple. More purple here means more robots. So it's not only that in industries we're seeing more investments in robots, which may not be terribly surprising, but there's also increasing geographic prevalence as well of robot adoption as time goes by. So next slide, please. So what's the data that we use? So I'll talk very quickly about this because I know we're supposed to mostly talk about our results. So the robot investment data actually comes from firm level imports recorded by the Canadian Border Services Agency. In Canada is actually a very good context to use this data as a good measure of robot adoption, primarily because there's no meaningful domestic robot production in Canada. So if you want to buy a robot, it has to cross the border in some form. And robots are also classified as distinct from other technologies as well. So in other words, this isn't being bundled in with other types of industrial manufacturing machinery. And so we don't have issues of needing to separate the robots out from other types of things. So with respect to total employment, we use a data set that I would just call the NANCEY. It has a relatively long name and you can see it there. And for some of the more detailed employment effects, and analyzing organizational change, we will use a survey called the Workplace and Employee Survey. So next slide, please. So what are the main findings? I'm going to show you some regression results in a bit, but just kind of the big bottom line. So the first thing we find is that robots are actually associated with an increase in total employment, but composition has changed. So as I said before, it's not that all categories of workers end up increasing here. We find that basically high and low skilled employment increases, and I'll define that more clearly in a few slides. But middle skilled employment decreases. And moreover, we find an association of robot investment with an increase in the strategic importance of improving product quality, not necessarily of cutting labor costs, which speaks a little bit to what might be the motivations for firms to actually buy these robots and adopt them. Our preliminary evidence suggests that it may be more about improving the quality of products as opposed to we really need to replace the people inside the firm. Now, with respect to organizational change, we also find evidence of both decentralization and centralization of decision authority in the hierarchy, depending upon the particular tasks. But a common theme that we find there is that decision authority is being shifted away from managers actually inside the firm. They're losing authority. Next slide, please. So what I want to show here, you don't need to read every single one of these closely. I've highlighted here the row here, which is the robot coefficients. I just want to draw your attention to the consistency. So we see positive and significant relationships across different sectors of the Canadian economy in predicting total employment. So if you were wondering, is it that robots are good for some industries in terms of employment and really bad for other industries if you cared about total employment? What we find, at least here, is that that's probably not the case, that we're finding something that appears to be quite consistent. In fact, if we go over to the next slide, just to drag this out even further, other sectors of the Canadian economy, and I've included here on the right, columns 5 through 8, even elements of the non-manufacturing segments of the economy, again, positive and significant, consistent coefficients pointing all in the same direction, suggesting that there is a positive relationship between robot adoption and total employment, which again speaks to the main findings I had mentioned earlier. So next slide, please. Okay, but I did also say that composition had changed. So what this is, let me talk about on the left here, the definitions of high, middle, and low skilled. So we're very clear about this. High skilled, as it is defined in the survey, is a job that requires at least an undergraduate degree or equivalent. Middle skilled is a job that requires a community college certificate or a diploma or vocational trades accreditation or the equivalent. And low skilled is, as you can suspect, it's something that doesn't really require much anything of that. So it's a job that requires no more than 1 month of training for someone with no trade or vocational accreditation. And so columns 1, 2, and 3 are just looking at, well, what happens when robot adoption occurs and predicting the numbers of each skill category of employee. And so column 1 here, you can see positive and significant. So it's predicting an increase or a larger number of high skilled workers. And column number 2 is the total number of middle skilled. We see that there's a negative relationship there. So there's fewer middle skilled workers And column 3 here is total low-skilled workers, again, positive and significant, so predicting more low-skilled workers. So, of course, this raises the question, beyond the regression, what do we think it is that's happening here? So what we suspect is happening when we look into some of the anecdotal evidence, when we dig into the data, a lot of middle-skilled jobs, if you look very closely in the manufacturing sector, do things that robots can do. In many of these contexts is what we were finding. And so what we suspect is happening is that there's a direct substitution with this type of labor. The high skilled is probably not that surprising for most of you. If you're familiar with the skill bias technical change, previous ways of IT, what we found in a lot of contexts is that these are very likely to be design and programming types of jobs, kind of higher level skill jobs for working with the robots and being able to utilize them fully. And then there's, of course, the interesting question of, well, what about the low skilled? And we had to dig a little bit deeper for this to try to figure out what was going on. And what we think is going on here is that there are limitations to what robots can do, but these are not necessarily high skill types of work. So I'll give you one example. Amazon as a company is a very, very big adopter of robots. If you ever walk into one of their distribution warehouses or even just see videos of it, they invest heavily in robots. But one of the things that the robots actually still are not really able to do very well is load their trucks. So what they need to do is hire a lot of low-skilled labor to fill in this gap in their process. And what we found is equivalence to this in some other contexts as well, where the robots just for whatever reason are still constrained and been able to do some of these tasks, but they're not what we would call high skill type of work. And so what we see, taking a step back, broadly speaking, is evidence of potentially a skill polarizing effect, which feeds into the theme of inequity that Alexandra had mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So finally here, looking at organizational change, and again, by this, looking at who does what and has responsibility for what in the organization, the decision authority allocation. So we looked at two particular types of tasks. One is training decisions, and this has to do with employee training. And the way that the survey is structured is the possible responses are, who normally makes decisions with respect to the following activities, with the responses being, is it non-managerial employees? Is it managers in the hierarchy? Or is it business owners or corporate headquarters if it's a multi-establishment firm in that instance? And so what we find is, as you can see here in column 2, authority is being shifted away from managers, seemingly downwards in the hierarchy, to non-managerial employees. Over here, however, when we look at the choice of production technology in column 4, 5, and 6, in column 5, again, managers are losing authority over choosing the production technology, which might be things like robot adoption, for example. And that this appears to be shifting upwards in the hierarchy to the level of business owners or to corporate headquarters as well. Again, suggesting that above and beyond just simple employment effects, that the organizations themselves are also shifting as well. And in this case, managers are losing authority as well. So an interesting finding that we add to the mix as well. So, and I think that's it. So I don't remember having another slide. So Alexandra, you tell me. Yes, no, that's it. So thank you guys very much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Brian. It's a good slide to finish your presentation. Again, looking at the firm level data, we have several messages, I think. One is quite encouraging that, the scare of losing jobs to robots doesn't necessarily hold, but the increasing inequality perspective worries, of course, should worry actually a lot of people. So let us leave Canadian context right now and move across the border and go to the next presentation. It is my pleasure to invite Nancy Green-Lee, who is professor at the School of City and Regional Planning and Associate Dean for Research at College of Design at Georgia Tech in the United States. Nancy will be presenting a regional approach or regional analysis, how robots and skill demands are linked at the labor market scale. So Nancy, please.
Nancy, you need to unmute.
Yep, still muted, Nancy. I'm sorry.
Yes, there we go.
Perfect.
Okay. Apologies. Anyway, thanks for having me. This is really a great, interesting panel. And Brian was a great setup for my talk because I don't have time to go through all of the factors that he did before, but they're very complementary to what motivated our research and some of our findings. I should say at the outset that my research has been funded by the National Science Foundation's National Robotics Initiative. I had a 3-year grant that was really looking at the regional labor markets. And I'm currently in another 3-year grant that's looking at collaborative robots and their impacts or potential for assisting small and medium-sized manufacturers. And all of my research has been focused on manufacturing at this point because manufacturing is the first place where robots were adopted. And as Brian's data also showed you, it's automotives, the automotive area is where robots were first adopted, and it's still where the majority of all robots are. But my work is motivated on really looking at this question of what will happen to regional and local labor markets and businesses and economies as a result of increasing robotization. And the work before that Brian just highlighted, that's cited over and over, is really, as he noted, focused more at the macro level or the national and international level with grand and dramatic questions of the end of work, which we are in the process in this panel of helping to debunk, and I'm happy about that. I will say that, so I do think that the subnational variation in robotic diffusion, knowledge, and potential effects is understudied, and that was part of our motivation. And it has historically been a problem of data availability. Those previous studies that were cited all use International Federation of Robotics data, a measure of robotics diffusion. And it's important to know that that data is not actually counting robots, the stock of robots in countries. It's inferring it from the sales, the annual sales of robotic robots into countries. So it's inferred from a sales measure. It doesn't take into account the existing stock that's there and how long that stock lasts, when it is replaced, et cetera. So it's the measure that's used because for a long time, it's been one of the only sources of data that we have. And it still is important in many ways, particularly for international comparisons. But our research was motivated in trying to develop other data that could allow us to go below the subnational level, where unlike Canada, we did not until just very recently have any publicly collected data that was collected data on the use of robots. So that was published. So we started by, and we, I mean myself and my graduate research students in my lab, started developing robotics data from various sources and various methods. It's a mixed method process. We've collected data on robot suppliers and integrators from proprietary databases, business databases. And I want to call your attention to integrators. The integrators are a very key aspect of the diffusion of robots. And they actually, there's the cost of the robot, and then there's the cost of the system integration, particularly in the large firms. And the cost of the system integration can easily be 2 or 3 more times higher than the cost of the robots. So it's really the biggest expense in adopting robots and in diffusing robots. And they have a great deal of influence on the way in which the system is put together and on the use of labor within that. And they can be combining robots all from one company, and the company itself may have an integrator arm, or multiple multiple producers of robots can be incorporated into a production line. And those integrators that help do that kind of work are independent integrators. Where they are located is just as important as where the suppliers are, the robot suppliers are. And the US also is not a major manufacturer of robots at all. And in fact, when it has a successful robot company, it's typically bought up by another company. So the integrators are a very key aspect, and that's what you can see by looking at this next slide here. And And I'm sorry that you can't, the map can't show up that great here, but you can see that they are co-located in many cases with where the suppliers are, and they're in very limited parts of the country. So if you want, and they tend to be heavily focused in metropolitan statistical areas. So you can see that there are vast parts of the country that don't have exposure to integrators who are a key way in which knowledge is distributed about robots and the possibilities in helping firms figure out what they need. So that there is something I raised because it is a policy issue in a lot of ways. So there are substantial differences as a result of this in sort of the local robotics knowledge bases that are likely to affect regional automation capabilities or capacities. And this is another way in which you could see growing inequality in production and the profitability of production in regions as a result of where these integrators are established and where they are not. And so next slide. So next slide, please. So in our first research grant, we really focused a lot on thinking about skill demand, employment, and wages, and the impacts of wages, robots on wages. The data that we used to do this, again, because there was no public data, it was proprietary data. And in this case, we used real-time labor market information that's collected by a firm called Burning Glass Technologies. They actually, as the phrase is, spider the web. They collect data 24/7, 365 a year from all websites that are advertising jobs. And that data is typically packaged into a form that workforce development folks use to try and predict what the skill demand is going to be in a local or regional economy and what kind of training should be created. But we and other researchers have been able to buy the raw data from Burning Glass Technologies, in which we began to analyze the job advertisements that were including in the listing of skills, robot-related skills. So the great thing about the database, which is enormous, and for what we looked at, we had, for manufacturing alone, we had over 800,000 job ads that we were looking at. But we get the name of the firm and we get the geocoding. We can code where that firm is, and gives us a great ability to do subnational analyses. And what we also did was we used machine learning to search for job descriptions that eventually translated into 3 robotic skill categories of work that were emerging in manufacturing that we could identify. So that's kind of where we got to with our data. And one of the things we found was that across all MSAs, and this actually relates well to the first talk, the presence of robots in manufacturing actually was a presence of, or rather an increase in job postings demanding robotic skills in manufacturing predicted approximately a 2% growth in manufacturing employment between 2010 and 2016. And we found this both at the individual and the MSA level, and that there were wage premiums associated with the robotic skills. So we could see for the jobs that were advertising, for example, welders, but welders that could operate robots, they had a higher premium wage than those welders that did not. The skills required were not those that related to robots. So it is reinforcing that notion that advanced technology is associated with higher wages, but it also was associated with actual increase in manufacturing employment. So it suggests that those firms are more competitive, they're more productive, and they're expanding. Next slide, please. Okay, so another thing that we did was a survey of asking questions about robot adoption in manufacturers, because until just recently, and in fact, it was in March, the first data collected by the US Census Bureau on manufacturers' adoption of robots was made publicly available. It comes from the 2018 Annual Survey of Manufacturing, and the data is just being released now. What's really great about this for future research, for any folks interested in this, is that the Annual Survey of Manufacturers is a mandatory survey that all manufacturers have to answer. So you're getting a really great base of firms for analyses. We conducted our own survey of manufacturers. It was really hard to get manufacturers to answer the data, even though we used the NORC, the National Opinion Research Center out of Chicago, to help us administer that survey. But we did have enough answers ultimately to be statistically significant. And one of the things that we thought was most important, and with policy implications, was that there was a lower robot adoption rate among small and medium-sized manufacturers, which we began to question what that would mean for inequality in production, because the smaller firms may not be able to survive more international competition as a result of that. And many of them are located in more rural areas and in smaller cities. So there are implications there for how strong the manufacturing sector would continue to be. Then the newest robot adopters we found from the survey, based on our questions, on average have fewer employees, and they come from a wider array of industry sectors as opposed to just automotives compared to the early robot adopters. So we had a question about robot adoption in the 5 years previous, and then in the 5 years previous to that. And we also found that firms are more likely to adopt robots when they're located in a region with a large number of existing robot users and robot-related skilled labor. So there's that localization economy effect going on. Based on some of the results of that survey, we decided in our next research to really focus on small and medium-sized manufacturers and collaborative robots. So the important thing about collaborative robots, as distinguished from traditional industrial robots, is that they can be shown. An individual can, in many cases with these collaborative robots, can literally show them the activities that they need to do, the actions that they need to do on a production line. And that's the programming. It's just programming by moving the robot around. This is quite different than the sophisticated systems integration that occurs with the larger scale traditional industrial robots. So there's they've been in early stages of development, but that's changing. They were relatively slow to be adopted, and yet what's happened apparently since the pandemic began, and with some more advancements in collaborative robots, is that they're being picked up at a much higher rate than previously. So they have the potential to increase productivity, profits, and cope with labor shortages. And the other point I need to make here is that they are much cheaper to adopt within a firm. You do not have to incur the systems integration costs, which, as I said before, double or triple the cost of the robot use. So, and they're simpler to program, and they can work on, they work on smaller jobs, and they do have weight limits. So there are certain things that they'll never be able to do. And for a firm that may still need to combine collaborative robots with traditional industrial robots, and that is happening as well in some of the larger firms. So what we want to do here in this current research, which is just a year in, and of course affected by COVID, is a focus on identifying barriers and solutions to small and medium-sized co-robot adoption. This may help firms be more competitive, stay in business. We are hearing stories from industry. I regularly attend online some of the industry seminars and webinars about firms bringing back manufacturing to the US because of the supply chain disruptions that have occurred with COVID. And also firms trying to respond to increased demand by being able to run third shifts using the co-robots to run the third shifts. So they so far have not been labor replacing. They have been labor augmenting and allowing the firms to expand their production. And we want to systematically look at that more with some Delphi interview research that we're going to be conducting with 3 states manufacturing extension partnerships in the US. These are key organizations that receive funding from the federal and state governments to increase competitiveness and the strength of manufacturing in states. And every state in the country has a manufacturing extension partnership. So leaving it at that, because I know we're short on time, is there is disagreement and uncertainty about implications of robotics that, as I said at the beginning, I think very much require subnational data and subnational analyses. Countries are beginning to collect data on robot adoption, not just sales by firms. So that is really helpful. It's been a long time coming, and we can't do much in the way of historical analysis, but we can start to use it now, and that data can be analyzed at local or regional economy levels. The US and Germany are 2 examples, and there's a wealth of opportunity there for us to really understand more clearly the implications of robotics. And then one other thing I quickly wanted to mention was that another motivation for our research at this stage, particularly for collaborative robots, is to look at those industry sectors, Amazon warehousing being a prime example, where the majority of women and minorities tend to be working in the lower wage manufacturing and warehouse or supply chain type operations. The question is what, and if you read some of the stories about that kind of work, it's extremely physically demanding, and there are a lot of health issues for the employees in those situations. The collaborative robots themselves may have potential to, upgrade the work, upgrade the wages in those operations, and also provide healthier working conditions. So that's something that is a background piece that we'll be looking at later on in the grant, but we're very much focused on this issue of how to improve the jobs and the benefits and the wages for women and minorities in the low-paying manufacturing and supply chain sectors. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nancy.
And the last slide just simply lists some of the outputs of our research.
Wonderful. That's quite impressive. Thank you so much. We are running a little bit of time, over time, but the discussion was quite exciting, and I really couldn't really interrupt any of the speakers. I think the last 2 presentations nicely complement each other. So we saw in Brian's presentation that employment goes up as a result of robot adoption, but the composition really shifts within the firms. Now we look at the regional level and we see that the employment goes up, but mostly likely due to the new market opportunities that companies adopting robots are creating, because the robots, aside from being purchased, they need to be integrated, and this might require actually separate set of skills. So thank you so much. So far, it was extremely exciting. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A session. They are mostly methodological, so I would encourage our speakers, if possible, to answer one by one. I'm not sure if we should really bring them to the floor. And of course, the discussion of the link between adoption of advanced technologies and their implications for labor and for productivity wouldn't be complete without the OECD perspective. So it is my pleasure to invite Anna MILANEZ, who is a labor economist at the OECD, to say what actually we learned so far in the recent work done in her directorate. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alexandra and Mike, and also to the other presenters who have already made this very rich. I think that we're really triangulating from different perspectives on a similar message, which is essentially, I'm going to echo this notion we're drawing out that fears of automation are overblown, also when we look at an international context. So as Alexandra mentioned, I'm Anna. I'm going to present the results of a research paper that I've co-authored with my colleague, Alex Georgiev, who's also at the OECD. So being OECD, we're going to bring the context to an international level. Our paper, next slide, please. Our paper is titled, What Happened to Jobs at High Risk of Automation? This paper came out in January of this year, and in it, we aim to look at the impact of automation on the labor market across OECD countries. And here, our proxy for automation is a measure of automation risk. And our labor market outcome variables have come from national labor force surveys across OECD countries. So to give you the punchline at the outset, I mentioned this briefly, but essentially we do find evidence of job destruction among occupations that were estimated to be at high risk of automation. However, in the period over which we look, which is 2012 to 2019, we don't find that this translated into clear evidence of job loss at national levels. So automation does appear linked to declines among some occupations, and this was kind of mentioned already, but those occupations tend to be those comprised of routine manual tasks. But on net, we find no evidence that automation is driving joblessness across OECD countries. So in this slide, what I'm going to do is say a little bit more about the measure that we used, because in the research that's been presented so far, we're kind of choosing different metrics according to which we look at advanced technologies. So this is a measure of automation risk, and this choice was made because we're drawing upon previous work. Back in 2013, the OECD estimated that 14% of jobs across OECD countries were at high risk of automation. And we wanted to take that estimate and essentially evaluate the prediction and say, okay, what happened to these jobs? Did we in fact see job destruction among occupations that were estimated to be at high risk of automation? This measure is a little bit in conversation with the Frey and Osborne 47% that was mentioned by BRYAN earlier, in case people listening are familiar with that literature. So in this chart here, you see our measure of automation risk for a subset of countries. And in this chart, you have two bars. In gray at the bottom, you have the share of occupations that were estimated to be at high risk of complete automation. So that was the share of occupations estimated to be at risk of obsolescence over the next 20 years. And then in blue on top of that, you have the share of occupations that were estimated to be at significant risk of change due to automation. So if not completely made obsolete, at significant risk of the task mix in those occupations having changed. So there are just really 2 points that I'd like to make about this chart. The first is that automation risk is substantial. And that's something that, especially a point that BRYAN made nicely, that's something we know very well from headlines and the general topicality of this issue. I also agree that it's a bit overblown, but I like this measure because it's one that links the notion of automation risk to a metric-based approach. The second point that I'd like to make is that our measure of automation risk contains some nice variation across countries. So our measure is available at the occupation level. And the variation across country largely comes from differences in the mix of occupations by country. So that's to say, for example, that some countries have greater shares of occupations at high risk of automation compared to others. And that's something that also makes a lot of intuitive sense if we think of automation as a mega trend that's made its way through countries at different paces. There are both leaders there and then the laggard countries. So these degrees of automation risk might lead one to expect an impact on the labor market. The question, again, is, as BRYAN set out very nicely, is the net effect positive or negative? And that's something where the empirical literature isn't really conclusive so far. So that's essentially our question. With that, I'll move to the next slide, please. And like with all other speakers, there's a lot more detail in the paper, so I'll please refer you to that. But I'm going to present just two of our key findings, and this is the first. So our finding number one is that at a national level, employment growth has not been lower in countries that had a higher average risk of automation. So this is again agreeing with the speakers that have presented so far, that we don't have clear evidence of automation leading to job destruction. On the horizontal axis in this chart, you have a country's average automation risk. So when you go out further to the right, you have greater automation risk. On the left-hand side, you have lower automation risk. And then on the vertical axis, you have the change in employment level over the period that we're looking at. So 2012 to 2019. And what we see in this chart is that countries with high automation risk did not necessarily experience lower employment growth. And a good example of that, I don't know if you can see the labels well, but on the right-hand side, the rightmost dot is the Slovak Republic. And there we see both high risk of automation on average. So the dot is very far to the right-hand side, but also we had decent employment growth over the period. So when we look vertically, it's oriented pretty much in the middle. So all in all, we have no clear evidence of job destruction on the national level. And I'll say that there's some caveats to this result. I mean, as many of them were mentioned by the speakers, that things get tricky to identify when you're looking across so many countries at the macro level. That is a drawback to this approach. These results are also pretty tricky to interpret, given that the period that we look at, 2012 to 2019, was also one of rebound from the financial crisis. And so that's kind of entwined in here as well. But still, we think that this result is consistent with a story where technological change has a positive employment impact through the productivity channel. So productivity gains lead to higher incomes beget higher demand for goods and services, and then higher demand for goods and services leads to, in turn, greater demand for labor. I'll also just mention, I don't show it here, but I'll mention, since it relates to the work of BRYAN and NANCEY, that we also look at the relationship between employment growth at a national level and then the adoption of industrial robots. We do use that IFR measure. And when we look at that correlation, we find a positive relationship between employment growth and robot adoption, not adoption per se, but at least the export of robots. So that's also at least a stylized fact that's consistent with a positive productivity effect on employment. And next slide, please. I'll conclude by just highlighting our second finding, which nuances this kind of sunny picture that the impact on employment is strictly positive. So our second result relates to changes in employment within countries, and here we're looking at the occupational level. When we look within countries, we find that employment growth has indeed been lower for occupations that faced greater automation risk. So on this chart, on the horizontal axis, again, you have the average automation risk, but this time it's by occupation rather than by country. Riskier occupations, again, are further to the right on the horizontal axis. And the riskier occupations include those like drivers, mobile plant operators, agricultural workers, occupations whose tasks involve more routine manual work. And then on the vertical axis here, you have the change in employment again from 2012 to 2019 by occupation. So what we see here is there's a general negative trend line connecting these dots. So occupations that are at greater risk of automation experienced lower or even in cases negative employment growth over the period. Conversely, occupations at low risk of automation, so the dots towards the left of the horizontal axis, saw higher employment growth. So occupations at lower risk of automation were occupations such as health professionals, ICT professionals, personal care workers, in general, occupations that were heavier on interpersonal skills and tasks that could less easily be routinized. So taking together the results at the country level that I presented on the last slide, and then this, we think that these results indicate really that there's no need to be so alarmist about the impact of automation on employment, at least on employment overall, and this clear job destruction narrative. So rather than bringing about a clearly jobless future, we think that technological change is something that represents the prospect of a future with different jobs. At the same time, I also think it's really important to come back to this question of inequality that Alexandra, you threw out at the beginning, and then Nancy, again, you touched on. We know that automation results in uncertain employment prospects for certain socio-demographic groups in particular. So I mentioned that we were working with labor force survey data, and we really tried to slice and dice it according to many different groups, education level, skill level, gender, and unfortunately we had some trouble finding significance that adhered to a clear narrative at the broad OECD country level. But I think that there's a lot there that needs to be explored in greater detail. In particular, because we think that automation risk also is something that concentrates among certain groups, the low educated being one. I also want to bring up the fact that I don't know that it's really been mentioned so far, but the COVID crisis is something that adds to this uncertainty. We certainly hear, at least anecdotally, that COVID is something that's really accelerating automation as companies try to reduce reliance on human labor on the one hand, but also interaction between workers on the other. So we also make a push in this research paper for policymakers to focus on those workers affected by COVID and maybe out of jobs because of COVID, which is something I think we're learning about on a daily basis. Additional policy priorities that we talk about in this paper include social protection to cushion the impact on workers that are displaced by automation, and then education programs that focus on preparing and retraining workers for the jobs that are to be created. A last point that I'd like to make about this work that we've done and in an open area is that because we were working with labor force survey data and this measure of automation risk that we've already worked with within the OECD, we're only really considering the impact on occupations that are known so far. But I think that automation and other advanced technologies certainly have the potential to create new occupations. I don't think we necessarily know what they are, but this research doesn't touch upon at all jobs that might be created in those new occupation types. And so I think that that's another exciting inroad to develop. And with that, I think that I'll hand it back to you, Alexandra, for the discussion. Thank you,
Anna. Thank you. Again, wonderful wrap up and overview of the international evidence on the issue, and I will get back to it. I think we had pretty much all questions answered by our speakers. Thank you so very much. Let me summarize a few takeaways that I'm taking from this meeting, and I'm really pleased how the presentations came together in an aggregate picture. Apparently, the elephant in the room where everybody is alarmed or people tend to hear more about destruction of jobs by robots doesn't really hold in data. So this elephant in the room shouldn't be there, but apparently there is another elephant in the room, which more concerning, which is inequality. And the presentations today showed that this actually comes from several sources. We do have inequality in terms of firms, because stronger firms are more likely to adopt advanced technologies and become even stronger. So here, maybe we need to look more in the market opportunities that are created by these companies, because integration, all the services can come from the new companies. And it also links back to the questions that were raised several times on the age of the companies that adopt technologies. So I think one of the presentation had some suggestive evidence that the process becomes more democratic in a sense, where the smaller companies tend to adopt technologies now as opposed to as new adopters as compared to old adopters. And I think it's a nice sign in the data. When we look on the employee side, on the worker side, we also have evidence of displacement of the workers where the middle of the skill distribution becomes thinner. So here, I think for policymakers, we need to think how to reshape this process so more people are moving up the distribution as opposed to the bottom of the distribution. Again, this links to quite a bit of work on retraining, on upskilling, and there are a lot of other issues that can be brought and all other strategies that can be used by companies, but also maybe there should be some incentives for firms to reskill, or maybe for new companies that service robot adopting companies to come into business. One more thing, and it comes mostly from Anna's presentation, and I see it in other areas of research, which strikes me as very important and which we really do not pay attention to. It is the level of analysis. So the relationships that we see at the industry level do not necessarily translate into the same results when we look at the spatial level. And then we come to the issue of data, because data usually is more easily available at the industry level so far. And then policies, a lot of policies are designed at the regional level when we talk about place-based policies, when we talk about a lot of attempts to bring back places that are left behind, et cetera, et cetera. So policymakers, when they think about to design policies helping places, very often because of all the media hype, they can base their decisions on the evidence that comes from the industry level analysis, which may or may not hold for the regional applications. And I think here as researchers, we need to be extremely clear what we do and how we do it, but it's also our job to explain better to policymakers and so they pay attention to what level of analysis was conducted and whether this analysis directly applicable to policy creation or policy design, or it needs to be taken with specific caveats. And I think it's very important. I do not really see it much discussed, but I think today's presentations really showed this discrepancy in terms of the link between automation and job growth. I think one highlight for me personally from today was the huge variety of data sources used. And here I will follow up with most of the speakers actually to learn more about data sources and how different skills were defined, et cetera, et cetera. So it's extremely useful, I think, also for researchers who follow us today, maybe to reach out. I don't know if it is appropriate to reach out to the speakers, but definitely you can reach out to me and I will share whatever I learn from our speakers, because I think we all need to find ways to gain and build our knowledge, even when the publicly available, cleaned and nice data is not available, so we can fill these gaps. Now we have literally 5 minutes left. Let me check if we have any questions. I think all the questions were answered. Thank you again to all the speakers. I think if somebody would like to say a few words on whatever we discussed today, but also maybe if you have some suggestions for policymakers as we build back better, because I think that's a great opportunity for us to redesign our societies and economic organization to make it more inclusive, less unequal, and hopefully more productive. So Nancy, I see your hand raised. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention in manufacturing, there is this long-term difficulty of filling jobs. This has been going on for some time in the US. So that's another reason why we don't need to be concerned about robots so much. But it does go back to some of the things you've been talking about. It's real critical that we do the correct career technical education for workers so that they can take advantage of the best jobs in manufacturing. But we're also seeing across a number of sectors, retail, restaurants, supply chain warehousing, huge shortages of workers for jobs. And that's where I think we'll see a lot greater move, at least in the US, for the adoption of robots, because they're responding to labor shortages. And it seems strange, to think about that when we've had all these unemployed from COVID, but this is also sort of a long-term trend. So that's another factor. We had a negative birth rate in the last year. I think it's the first since maybe World War II, but many of our advanced industrialized countries have declining birth rates, and that means projections of labor shortages going forward. And we ought to maybe think about that and keep that as part of our analysis or considerations for the future.
Thank you, Nancy. Very, very valid point. And actually, I think quite a bit of OECD work is focusing on the aging societies. I think it's extremely pertinent for, let's say, Japan. And we do see that robot adoption is higher in regions where the average age is higher. So, Benoit?
Yes, since nobody is raising its hand, maybe I can talk about the two elephants that were raised. I guess I agree that productivity and is not the enemy of, it's not a problem in terms of labor creation. So Anna mentioned the income effect, but it's worth also mentioning the price effect of productivity, making the goods cheaper and increasing demand, and might be increasing the demand for the products produced by the industry. So that's another effect. The other elephant is inequality. So you mentioned upskilling and retraining. So I did a lot of work on training. But I'm not sure it's the solution to get those low-skilled workers or middle-skilled workers to higher skilled jobs. I think the evidence that those program work is not so strong. So I don't have a solution to policymakers, but I'm worried that when the solution that is given is retraining and upskilling, I guess I would be curious to see if countries with a better education system, like from kindergarten to primary to secondary school, are doing better in terms of workforce resilience, because I think that's might be where I would advise policymakers to put their energy. You need a workforce with strong numeracy, strong literacy. And if you don't have that, and people are going on the job market without those basic skills, I think they might be, I don't want to be gloom, but it will be hard to address inequality problems caused by automation.
Sorry, I apologize, I mute myself. Thank you so much. I just said that it was very insightful and I think realistic in terms of kind of grounding us down and highlighting that not all policies really work. I'm thinking that maybe actually continuation of the advanced technology adoption might create sufficient market opportunities for new industries, which would be hopefully better paid and would employ these people that used to be in the middle of the distribution, not necessarily, you know, rocket scientists. That of course, you know, not everybody can reach this level of skills, but also we don't need like everybody to be a rocket scientist. So one of the hopes is that what Nancy showed, the integration or whatever market opportunities are created by new way of organization of production in companies. So I think it is time now to pass the floor to Mike for his concluding remarks. It was a wonderful meeting. I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you so much to all our speakers. Thank you for answering the questions. We have one little note in the Q&A which says, perhaps automation can help make teaching better. I think this also a possibility, but I'm pretty sure it is something that can be debated, and we would have people advancing both positive and negative views on this. So I guess it depends. It depends what type of education, it depends for what purposes. Maybe in some segments, indeed, it can be something that would help us to maybe even cut costs of education, keeping the quality at the same level, or maybe increase the outputs and outcomes without increasing costs. And with this, I would like to pass the virtual floor to Mike. Mike, the floor is yours.
So first of all, I'd like to thank our speakers for the uniformly great presentations, which fit together so well and were so effectively done. I also really enjoyed this discussion right at the end and really thought it was important, because while it is clear from the presentations that we don't have to assume that just because there's growth in robotics and adoption of new technologies, that necessarily means there won't be employment growth and there will be jobs in the future. There will still, this hides, of course, that there will still be a lot of transitions. Lots of people will lose their jobs and have to get new jobs. And I think what Benoit said about training is very well taken. And I think that we have to manage these transitions. And so it's not like we're out of policy problems here, just because we don't think that the robots themselves are the problem. There's still lots of issues in labor market analysis, and particularly at the regional level, as in this process, inevitably some regions seem to get left behind. So the only remaining thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Center for Spatial Analysis for doing such a wonderful job in putting this event together. Really very much appreciated, and very, very impressed and very grateful to be part of a partnership with them.
Thank you, Mike. So with this, I would like to update those of you who are still with us that we will put together a summary, as we always do. We'll send it to all registered participants. So even if some people couldn't make it, they will still be able to follow. Of course, the recording will be posted on our website, and everybody is welcome to rewatch it and see the takeaways. And maybe I personally would go back to see the data sources for sure. Our next meeting is planned in early September. We will be talking about innovation diffusion, how it works, when it doesn't, what are the barriers, and what policymakers can do to remove them. Going forward, I think SPL meetings will be held 4 times a year, and we will try to keep the schedule even if we go back to normal and our meetings will be finally in person. Thank you so much again. It was great pleasure, and I hope we'll be in touch soon. Bye.